what emerges from this point of Synbio, what it starts to look like in the future is like up for grabs. And that's interesting and scary and exciting.
Hey, Karl, how's it going?
It's been a very, very busy couple of weeks. Last week was especially insane. I think we had events in New York City, biotech events every single night, right?
Yes. Oh my gosh. Between the both of us, we were super busy, bouncing around Manhattan, bouncing around Brooklyn. I also went to Red Hook, so I can talk a little bit about that.
Wow,
But
I didn't know that.
Yeah. I went all over the New York City metro area, and as did you. So let's highlight a few of these events. I mean, the one that both of us went to, because sometimes we like to divide and conquer because we have lives and not just hitting up the biotech scene nonstop. But we went to the West End Labs Biotech Barbecue. Oh my goodness. That was quite the event. What did you like about it?
For me, the highlight of a barbecue is the barbecue. My father was a meat cutter. We grilled a lot of meat in the house. So I always love when someone else is grilling meat for me. So Anthony Johnson was the pit master along with Yasmin Patty's husband, who I'm sorry, I don't know his name, but the barbecue was superb. The location is superb. The food was amazing. And it's always just great to run into our friends.
Yeah, absolutely. So Anthony Johnson, biotech entrepreneur, developing therapeutics, which is really cool. I think this crew that West End Labs, which is a beautiful, beautiful lab space in the West End. So very clear name for their labs. And it's great that they bring together a lot of biopharma focused people. I think they're looking to bring in more bioindustrials, biomaterials people that are part of our crew. We're trying to bring them into our crew so we can really get a biotech community together, not just in these isolated industry specific buckets. But I went to the one last year, which was also incredible. It was around Thanksgiving time. So it was more of a Friendsgiving, and there was just so much food. It was insane. And I got to meet some of the best people. West End Labs is run by Taconic, and there's Matt Malone, Matt Weir, and Peter Sheehan, incredible people. They are so friendly and open to talking about, of course, real estate. That's what they do from the day to day, but what companies' needs are. Can they connect them with investors? Can they connect them with other people? Very, very friendly. So it's so great to be in their orbit, part of their circle, and just love going up to the West End and seeing their lab space.
Yeah, I should mention, just for what it's worth, that was Tuesday or Wednesday. And Monday, I had been at the H.C. Wainwright investment conference, which was a 3-day, all day long investment conference at a hotel in Midtown. And then on Monday night, they had a dinner at Tavern on the Green, which, if you're not from New York City, that is a restaurant bar on the Upper West Side of Manhattan in Central Park. And this investment bank bought the place out. It was open bar, lots and lots and lots of food, just incredible amounts of food, and also great networking, 100% focused on biopharma. I would talk about biopharma, but then I would also talk about the bioindustrials, biomaterials, all the other things we talk about here on the podcast. And I would say a couple of people looked at me cross-eyed, like, what are you even talking about? Like they had no idea, which is always a bit surprising, because then at West End Labs, I had a conversation with Sam Waxel, who was the founder of ImClone, started a company called Erum, I think is what it's called, has a new company called Graviton. He's an OG in biotech therapeutics, has a very interesting reputation. We're going to try to get him on the pod. I told him a lot of the biotech analysts don't know what bioindustrials are. And he said, those people should be fired. You need to understand what is happening across biotech. So I really enjoyed the H.C. Wainwright event and also really enjoyed seeing Sam Waxel. But then we divided and conquered. On Thursday night, I went to an event for Life Science Cares. Life Science Cares is a nonprofit organization that works with biopharma companies to increase STEM education among unrepresented populations in New York City. And the organization started in Boston. They have a branch in San Francisco and San Diego, and New York is one of the newer ones. Our friend Elizabeth Fassberg is the director. So that was a very small event. It was also on 42nd Street near Times Square. Great to run into some really nice people there. Ran into our friend Steve Reddy, Joe Wolf, one of the life science head of RSM, which is a service provider for banks and venture funds. He was the host. And great to see how Elizabeth has been building that organization and seeing it be very successful in the city. And then I did a crazy drive to Richmond and back over the course of Friday and Saturday. And you went out to two more events, Erum. You held our space at the GenSpace birthday party. How was that?
That was so wonderful to be there. Of course, GenSpace holds a special place in our heart. That's where you and I met 10 years ago. And you are on the board of GenSpace. Everyone was asking about you, Karl. They're like, where's Karl? We really want him to be here. Like,
and I'm sure they said it exactly like that.
Yeah, they did. And I was like, you guys can see him at any time. But of course, it's a special event and they wanted you to be there, your aura, your vibe. But I held it down. I was like, look, Karl's not here, but I'm here to help. I arrived a little early to see how I could be helpful. GenSpace has a new executive director, Casey Lardner, who is incredible. We're talking about some future plans for GenSpace, and she has a great plan and strategy to work with you, of course, and the rest of the team. But it was a lot of fun because we saw a lot of our friends attended. Suzanne Lee was there. You mentioned Stephen Reddy. Of course, he attends all these events because he's such a great part of our community. Beth Tuck, who is super fan of Grow Everything and a Patreon. So we really love Beth. And she came up from DC, where she now works with the government. And GenSpace OGs. We had Dan Grushkin there, Alan Jorgensen, who's been on the pod, who runs Biotech Without Borders up in Long Island City. It was great. We were reminiscing about the past. We were talking about the future. There were raffles and games. They had a science trivia host being the MC for the night,
wow.
who was hilarious, by the way. All the science jokes. Some of us got some things, some of us didn't get some things, but we were all laughing. We were all smiling. We were getting to know each other, testing out our knowledge, great food, great drinks. And it was all at New Lab, which is also a wonderful space to be in, very supportive of the biotech community. They also have a small biotech lab for people to start testing out their own ideas there. And the Navy Yard. I mean, you cannot beat the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Anytime I go there, I feel like I'm ready to build a ship. I'm like, I'm ready. Yeah, like, let's do this. So it is a great, great space. Several of us actually hung out later that night. Again, hung out with Suzanne Lee and Allie Cutland, who we need to have on the pod, talking more about what's going on in the bio-based ingredient space, in the biotech beauty space, which is a very new category that we're looking at and very interested in, which was, again, super fun. And then my little Red Hook adventure was because Beth Tuck was in town. We all got together. It was also Stephen Reddy's birthday. Julie Wolf was there and several people that you know very well. We went to a beautiful open space brewery called Strong Rope, which is right on the water. Perfect view of the Statue of Liberty and Manhattan as the sun set behind the Statue of Liberty. It was the perfect evening, perfect Saturday evening to spend with some like-minded people that are super friendly and a wonderful time. But anyway, long story short, what a great week.
It was a tremendous week. What's amazing to me is getting all these scientists together, getting everybody talking about investment, about technology, about what's going on in the life sciences. I think it's a perfect introduction to our podcast today because all of these conversations took place primarily among scientists or investors. So everybody has a level of understanding and is able to communicate with each other fairly effectively. I did joke around saying that some of the biopharma analysts didn't really know anything about bioindustrials. It doesn't mean they didn't understand it once I got into talking about it. But when we think about science communications, one of the things that we talk about a lot is the failure of scientists to communicate effectively in general. And then the public's misunderstanding or not understanding what is happening with science and technology, which is too bad. Because on one level, everyone is a scientist. We're all inherently curious, and we can really approach life with that curiosity. That makes us all scientists because science is about curiosity and making discoveries. But sometimes that discovery is just, hey, I put salt in the water, it boils faster. But at the same time, everyone is a storyteller and everyone is a consumer of stories. We're living in an age where it's dominated by social media. We can go on any social channel. There's people telling stories in multiple media. What is that intersection between scientists and storytellers? That's something that we work on at Messaging Lab. Our guest today is going to talk about that. But before we get into that, is there anything you wanted to add to that intro, Erum?
You said it correctly. I mean, scientists often do have some difficulty explaining their science, and there's several reasons for that, which we'll get into. And I've noticed that even at these events that we went to, that when I'm casually speaking to a scientist about the work they're doing, they're speaking effectively. But once they get in front of someone who's a decision maker or an investor, or they realize that they might need to be a little bit more professional, they get caught up and start talking very scientifically. And that does a disservice because then you're not really talking from your heart, and something that we'll get into with our guest today. Our guest is Christina Agapakis, who is an excellent science communicator. She had worked at Ginkgo Bioworks for 10 years, and you've known her for quite some time, since the beginning of her endeavor there.
I think I've known Christina. It's funny, I feel like I've known her forever. She had just joined Ginkgo, but I don't think that's where we met. I think we actually met at the first Biofabricate, or maybe before. Christina's a very unique person. She's done art projects. She taught at UCLA in the design school, I believe. And we'd always stayed in touch. And throughout her tenure at Ginkgo, we were probably talking to each other a few times a year. We'd see each other at Ferment, at Symbio Beta, and other events. And I think we're kindred souls in that we care deeply about science and science communications. So it was really good to have her as an ally. And we're thrilled to bring her onto the pod to talk about what she's doing. And I think we're going to spend a lot of time just talking about how scientists communicate.
Okay, let's take it away.
All right, Christina Agapakis, we are so pleased to have you on the Grow Everything podcast. You and I have known each other for a really long time. I'm so pleased to have you here.
More than 10 years.
Yeah. How's that possible?
Well, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. I'm super excited for this conversation. I know Erum is super excited for this conversation. I think there's some people that we've had on the podcast where we've been able to have a lot of fun. The conversation gets kind of rambling. We go in a lot of different directions, but I think we'll try to keep it focused on scientific communications and marketing. And so let me just start off with a big question. What's the biggest challenge that biotech companies face when it comes to their communications?
Oh, it's such a big question, and it's so interesting. I think there's actually a meta problem to communication as a scientist, which is scientists are deeply, deeply distrustful and skeptical of communication, and in fact, afraid of communicating. I remember really vividly, very early in grad school, writing one of my first proposals. I think it was like for some sort of grant or a grad student proposal. And I was trying to write it up, and it's hard to translate that thing and write the story. And it took me a long time to think about it. I remember also at that time as a student, as a scientist, really thinking of myself as a scientist. I do lab work. I'm a scientist. I'm not a writer. I'm not good at that stuff. That is outside of my expertise. And I remember my PI being like, oh, wow, this is really well written. You can tell you worked really hard on this. And I was like, what? Like, and I remember that encouragement, like tiny little bit, opened me up to thinking about that part of the craft and the work that it takes to write scientific stories and to really think about it. I mean, that was many years ago now. And I sort of remember, again, those things happening over and over. I remember the first time someone called a scientific paper a story. And I was like, it's not a story. That's data. That's the knowledge. That's a scientific record. But it's also a story. And to have something that is a narrative that helps people understand what you did and why it matters is a story. That's work to be done, to connect to another person, to be able to craft those things. But at the same time, that feeling that I had as a student of like, that's not right. That's not a story. I'm not a writer. I'm a scientist. Those worlds being apart causes a lot of problems. I think that identity issue for science and scientists and science companies, and that, yeah, we put communication outside or downstream of the work of doing science. We are like, oh, well, that's not the real thing. That's later. And then you're not actually like thinking about, again, that craft and how the narrative actually influences the way that you might shape the story of the scientific work. I think often it is that identity that makes it really hard for companies to do communication, to do marketing, to do it well as part of the way that they're building their science and building their company. So I see this over and over again, this pattern of like, oh yeah, communication. You can feel this fear and you feel this mistrust, like, oh, that's like the marketing. That's like, oh yeah, you guys will come in over and make it look pretty. At the end, you'll help us get it out there. Just tell people about it. You don't invest it appropriately. You don't give it enough resource. You don't give it enough trust. You don't let it in. And you don't really think deeply about that story and your identity and why it's all matters and what it's for and who it's for. The quality of the communication's that good. The marketing's not that effective. You have this taste of it's not quite right. They didn't get it right. Those comms girls, they don't understand. They don't really know the science, blah, blah, blah. And then it's this horrible self-perpetuating cycle. Anyway, that's the stuff I've been thinking about a lot for many years now, but especially recently. Why do we hold communication away? Why do we think about it as something later or disconnected from the science when it is so foundational to how we even build our understanding of science and what we're trying to do and why it matters in the world? So I want to bring that upstream and I want that to be recognized as part of the way of doing science. That's why I think it's bad and hard.
Yeah, no. And I mean, first of all, we wouldn't have a business if scientists were great communicators. And I think that it does science writ large a disservice, because what happens is that scientists, by not communicating with the public, it almost makes it like, oh, these guys are scientists. They do something hard. It's a secret. We don't really understand it. And as a result, they lose funding. The public is afraid of science. And the perception of it is it's this other thing, even as a religion is the way people perceive it, that they don't understand it. What's bad about that is government investing in science is down and continues to be always put into question. And people don't understand that science and technology are the big drivers of the economy. It's where jobs are created. And so I think scientists in general, by not communicating effectively, not even talking about companies, but scientists in general, by not taking advantage of telling their stories, lose out by not doing it.
Well, it's so interesting. I think that sense of communicating to the public, maybe even deeper to that, nearly everyone is the public when you're talking about almost any science. That in fact, everything is so niche. There's a tiny world where my technical expertise lies. And then for everything else, I also am the public, even with a PhD, even with many, many years of experience in science. So that sense of where those edges are, or even the sense of there's many publics and there's many reasons to communicate. I think maybe that'll be fun to actually talk about. I think that there's a part of communication that is to that, even to your own niche world. How your career advances, how you build science, how science moves, it happens through communication. You go to conferences, you write papers, you have lab meetings. Those moments of connection between human beings and those objects of communication are how science moves. I think, again, in a very foundational way, we have to communicate to do science. And then there's also all of the publics. Who is funding you? Who is hiring you? And the general public. And I think, in fact, again, everyone is in that general public because not everyone cares about those details that your niche community cares about. But there are reasons to communicate. And that sense of where that fits into funding, where that leads to impact, how all of those things fit together. So many interesting connections and combinations. We spend the whole hour talking about that. How do you even formulate the question that you're asking? How would you even think about what matters? Would be the right thing? What would be fundable? Actually, I was just reading, there's a great paper. My old colleague Joseph sent me this really amazing history of peer review. Peer review even became something that was a norm and an expectation in how science moves and travels in the 70s in the Cold War America, because a lot of Congress was like, what are we funding all the science? What are you guys doing out there? I don't trust all that you're doing. Look at these silly papers that are coming up. The professionalization of peer review as how science advances and moves and how we communicate that science to more broadly is also again about building trust with those funders, with those things. There's so much interesting stuff you can start to untangle and unpack when you think about how do you build stories? How do you build questions? How do you build trust? How do you get political capital and economic capital to move that science and to ask those questions and to think about maybe it does translate into something that a company can do to bring a new product into the world too. All of those questions, again, communication is the heart of all of that because they all happen by people doing things together. And you have to communicate to be able to do things together.
Yeah, this is why I'm excited to have you on the pod. You help really dig into the communications because it's a lot of people are like, oh, I know communications. I speak to people. But it's like, no, there is a science behind communications as well. Everything has a purpose. I mean, within Messaging Lab, we have a whole framework for businesses. You have a mission statement, vision, positioning statement. You have your press release intro. All these different statements have a specific purpose to elicit a response from your audience. I really appreciated your thinking around even between scientists, there needs to be clear conversations. The geneticists speaking with the data scientists, they're butting heads too. It's not super clear. So that same story that you're telling to the public that needs to happen between scientists, especially today when we have biotech, you have a lot of people on the computation side talking to the experimental side, and they need to be able to have that conversation so they actually make a good product, but also help the actual story of the platform. Also, you've been doing this on a very big scale. You had been doing it for a while at Ginkgo Bioworks. Can you tell us a little bit about how you ended up there? You have a very great background. You went to Harvard, PhD in synthetic biology, genius. So I see why they snapped you up. But how did you end up there? And tell us a little bit about that experience.
Sure. I think the story of how I ended up at Ginkgo is, again, the story of a lot of these threads coming together. So, and it really starts back in those kind of very earliest days in grad school, and even that grant proposal that I was writing and drafting. So I started grad school thinking I was going to be like a pharmacologist, medicinal chemist. I had the very good fortune of meeting Pam Silver during like grad school orientation. And she's like, I'm doing this thing called synthetic biology. And I was like, what the heck is that? What are you talking about? She's like, yeah, we're going to solve climate change. We're going to make stuff with biology. We're going to design living systems. It's going to be great. That's a story. That's a vision. That's a way of thinking about this thing that I was obsessed with biology, I'm obsessed with microbes and proteins and enzymes. And I thought, again, look, the way that makes impact is in making drugs. But in fact, just that sentence introducing me to synthetic biology, again, totally like a frame shift, like a frame of mind that now like, oh, I could use biology in these different ways. I could apply it to these different kinds of problems. I could ask different kinds of questions of biology. I could interact with this thing that I love in a new way. And that conversation, that changed my life. Like, oh, I'm going to work with you. This is cool. I want to do this forever, or at least for now. What was so interesting then, like that frame of mind all of a sudden about thinking about impacts and applications and how these things translate in the world and how we solve these problems. We're working on biofuels. This is back in 2006. We're going to make fuels. We're going to change the world. We're going to solve climate change with biofuels. I'm laughing now because why that didn't work is itself a whole interesting story about, are we asking the right questions? Are we thinking about the right problems? Are we thinking about all of the different things that go together to make these things happen and how technology and politics and society and all communicate with each other? So at that time, again, I was like, oh, wow, climate change is more than just what I'm doing with these enzymes. It felt almost, I don't want to say dishonest, but it did feel like a sense of, it's not going to work. What are we doing? Like I'm not going to be able to actually make a fuel that people are going to use. So what is the point here? How people use things, how these things move, the power of these companies and industries and technologies and governments is so tied up in how all this stuff moves. And I need to learn about that. And the more I was like asking those kinds of questions, the Harvard people, not Pam for what it's worth, but a lot of the Harvard were like, don't talk about that. Don't worry about it. Just be good at Western blocks. Like, be good at, you should be learning something else. You're here to do something else. Don't worry your little head about that. That's not for you. That's downstream. That's outside of the science. I was like, but it's not downstream. It's actually upstream of what we're doing. We're saying we're going to do this for this reason in this world in there, but that's not working. There was a gap in the translation. And so I spent all this time trying to learn and find who was talking about that, where was it going, what could I even do? I'm going to write a blog and write about these things and write articles. And then I kept meeting interesting social scientists, interesting artists, interesting designers, asking similar questions, trying to open up and be in that gap in between where the science was and where the impact could be and what's happening there. I fell in love with all these artists. I was asking all these kind of questions. I started doing more and more media and thinking about these tools of writing and thinking in public to open up that space, which felt really closed off and a real boundary being drawn by my colleagues in the sciences. There was a world there for me. So I kept digging in there and on and on and on and on. Now, years later, I'm moving back to Boston. My pals at Ginkgo are and Y Combinator. They're doing really interesting things. I want to be in that space still. Where does technology lead to impact? How do we connect across and bridge there? And I started as a consultant at first, thinking like, oh, let's think about media. Let's think about these narratives. Let's think about impact. Let's think about the concerns people have around GMOs. How does that translate to what your customers are thinking about when they think about like how these things will translate? And then that turned into a full-time job for 10 years. That was really intense and beautiful and interesting. Really thinking about how do the connections we make with people lead to impact or growth of the business.
From like my own perspective and talking to Karl, and we always use Ginkgo as one of the examples of amazing marketing that they have built a brand, and we attribute a lot of Ginkgo success to that brand and marketing to really stick out from those other companies that were doing genetic engineering or strain engineering and some of the services they provide today. But Ginkgo stood out because of the story, because of the marketing, because of all the other efforts that were led by you and some team members. So amazing, amazing work. It was something that you should be very, very proud of.
Yeah, we even have a slide when we are talking to people about brand building that shows the Ginkgo timeline. Here's the founding. Here's the video that you created that was a recruiting video that was up and was really the only communications for many years. Here's the start of being much more public in terms of the storytelling. Here's the launch of Grow Magazine, the Ferment Conference, and all those things and how they built into this story. And yet, on the other side of it, we've had people say to us, investors, they're just a storytelling company. They're not really doing anything. It's just marketing.
You have to do both. I mean, I think that skepticism, I think, is part of that. Again, that connects to that fear or that sense that it's separate from the science or different. Obviously, it would be bad if it were just a story, but it has to be both. But I think there is a distrust in science. I remember this even in grad school. Oh, their slides look nice. Or the data should speak for itself. That is just literally never true. The data does not speak for itself. The company doesn't speak for itself. If you don't speak for yourself, somebody else is speaking for you. That is a choice, not speaking, not making an effort to make it look nice, not connecting to people. I think we continue to have this fear of genetic engineering. There's this great scholar of social studies of science. Her name is Claire Maris, and she wrote this awesome paper about symbiophobia phobia. We as scientists are so afraid of the backlash that shapes a lot of our behaviors and a lot of our thinking and a lot of how we communicate. And it's that fear, I think, that does hold back a lot of communication and like restricts a lot of connection. And that was a fear that we like really leaned into as at Ginkgo, because that fear was stopping us from being able to do the real work. If no one wants to pay us to make a strain, to make an ingredient, because they're afraid that people are not going to want to eat foods that have GMO ingredients, then there's no business for Synbio. So you have to do both that marketing and storytelling so that we can get to work and actually build those strains and actually make those ingredients. And that was really why you do need both at the same time.
Yeah, talking about the fear, Karl and I were pitching a biotech startup yesterday, and this was the number one thing they were talking about. Not saying fear, but they were saying, how do we create a very simple message and stay true to the science? And because we don't want to lie, because we don't want to say things. We see other companies. There's this one company that's saying this, and that's not exactly what they're doing, but they're saying this. And they were really hung up on the communications. So we were responding to them, but I would love to hear your thoughts on how do you respond to scientists when they're like, how do I even get a message out? Because I need to be very truthful to the science, and it's so complicated. And I can't just say it in 2 words because it's not true, because it's not true to what we're doing.
I think there's a real heart to it. And I think that's the challenge for science, period. The story that you write in your paper is not exactly what happened. And again, not to say that it's not true. It's just that it's a story that helps people see what matters for them to take action based on what you said. When you do experiments, it doesn't quite work. I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to fiddle with it. I'm going to do all these different kinds of things. And then when you go back and say the story, you're like, well, okay, let me tell you why this thing, it matters. Is that a lie? I would say no, but it's a story. And that is part of the work. And it's a lot of work and a lot of time that the scientist spends to do that. So I think there's probably like 2 aspects of it on the simplification or the fear of dumbing down. On the one hand, I think it's like they don't want to put in that work. It's work to be able to get it down to a short enough, concise enough point. The same way that it is work to write a paper, that is the concise, whatever, 3-page version of what you spent years on. That's work to be done. And it's real work to make it simple enough. You need to work through those feelings. Like, if I dumb it down, I'll seem dumb. You won't see all the work that went into doing this or why it matters. So I see this a lot. And especially now, like, I'm doing more work with earlier stage things and people and scientists very, very early on in their stuff. And they're like, oh, but it's all these different things. And it's like, okay, I know there's all there. And that's amazing. Let me in. What's the thing that's going to help me get started so I can dig deeper into those layers? It doesn't have to all be there at once. So even this idea of the 3-word version, think of that as the keywords of your paper. Then you have a title, then you have an abstract, then you have figures, then you have the text, then you have all these things. And nobody reads all of that anyway. So again, people do want to understand your keywords, your title, your abstract. Those are all technologies. So even what you're saying, you have a tagline, you have boilerplate, you might have real papers. All of those are tools that take work to make and use effectively. But I don't see them, again, as fundamentally different or at odds with the work of doing the science and communicating in those other ways. Part of it. So I think part of it is helping scientists open up to that and feel okay with that and feel okay with how there's a risk and a vulnerability there too. When you publish something, when you put something out there, it means you're not like people can attack you. When it's your tiny little world after peer review and after it goes through everything, like maybe that feels a little safer. But once it leaves that, there's a lot of things that can happen, a lot of different interpretations, and that can also be scary. Part of it is really, it's like an emotional work that you need to do.
Hi, a quick shout out to our sponsor, Messaging Lab, the force multiplier for biotech. Your biotech company is making the world a better place. You know that, we know that. But does the world? There's a big reason why some biotech companies attract investors, sign up customers, and get attention. That reason is strategic communications. At Messaging Lab, we translate complex science and economics into compelling narratives. And we have done that for the most successful biotech companies across healthcare, agriculture, personal care and beauty, materials, and the list goes on. We're here to make sure your ideas not only get heard, but resonate with your audience. So if it's time to amplify your company's voice, visit messaginglab.com to explore how we can elevate your story and grow your business.
And I think what makes it extra challenging is our increasingly time-crunched world where you have to be able to catch your audience's attention in such a short period of time. I mean, like 3 seconds is what we're seeing. And there's so much noise. So I think for our job collectively, the 3 of us and in the work we do, is helping the scientists understand that there's multiple levels of communications. There is that headline that is designed to draw people in. It doesn't mean that your whole story is false. It's like you have to come up with that hook. And then who are you communicating to, understanding what that audience is? I love using K18 as an example because they do have those multiple levels of communications. It's like, I just want to know the product works. That's one level. I want to understand a little bit of the science behind the product. That's another level. And then there's the people who are like, I really want to see the primary research so I can dig in and really understand how this thing works. And so we see that along that continuum with them. And then circling back to what you said about this GMO phobia, I know I've been guilty of that. And with K18, I was very concerned when they were launching their AirWash product because it contains a fusion protein that is genetically modified. K18 leaned right into it, and that product has sold out every time it's been on the market because it works. And so there is that whole other level of communications where people just care about the functionality of a product, especially in the consumer space. And if there's a great story behind it and we can lean into the story, then we're lucky on the communication side.
You want to hear my spicy take on this, actually?
Okay, go ahead.
I think that scientists will blame the public being stupid or not
Mhm.
understanding science and not liking GMOs as cope because they're bad at making great products.
Snap!
Right? I mean,
That is
Yeah.
like,
spicy.
if you have a good product, no one cares. Like, that's not actually the problem. It's like, oh, my product that performs less well, is marketed and branded badly, is more expensive than other options, and is not available to anybody in any meaningful scale. No one bought it. It's because they hate GMOs. Like, what?
Yeah.
What are you talking about? And I think that fear also stops us from understanding what people would want to buy. I think there's this sort of reflex. People are bad and stupid. They're not going to understand. Don't tell anyone that it's GMO. What is it for? What are you making? Why do it at all? I think on the other side, when you said something about fast pace, I didn't think immediately about TikTok. You got to grab someone in like a second. What that triggered for me is the busyness that people make for themselves too. There's so much of a sense of, oh, we're too busy for that. I have so much to do. I'm so busy. I'm doing so many things. I can't slow down and take a breath and think about what it means and what people would think about it. And they're not putting in the work because they're busy working. But I think losing sight of what really matters in that busy work, if you're not spending the time to be like, who are we? What is this for? What are we doing? What's the story here? Often like the hardest stuff to do in science and in technology and in business. And I think, again, it's stuff that gets short shrift because we're busy. We're working hard. We're building things. I think you need to be able to do both at once. Take that breath, which can be scary again, to pull yourself out for even 20 minutes and think about it. Anyway, that's my advice.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it'd be wonderful through storytelling to help the audience take that breath because you have such a compelling narrative that they go down the rabbit hole with you. So being able to do the breadcrumbs and be like, okay, now you're at a place where we're doing this amazing science and the world's going to look different because we're doing this thing. Join us in whatever capacity the audience would join, whether it's fundraising or buying the product. And then I do want to say too, the GMO phobia, we're going to have to use that. Maybe that'll be the title of something, but if we had
I'll find the paper.
Yeah. Oh yeah, find
Yeah.
paper.
Citation. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll put in our show notes. Zach Abbott of Biotics, I'm sure you're
Yeah.
familiar with Biotics. They have done a consumer sentiment on GMOs because their product is a GMO. And a lot of people are like, you know what? We don't really care about the GMO as long as the product works. If you have a good product and you're saying that it's going to help me do X, Y, and Z, let's do it. And even just if you're looking at the products that are being purchased, more than half of them are GMO. So it's interesting to see. And I know we're all speaking to each other and we're all coming from the same cloth in terms of, yeah, we're GMO fans. I think the more we educate through marketing, the more people are going to be excited about it. And something we say that GMO might be a stamp of premium products eventually, rather than something to fear.
Actually, you said marketing. The marketing that you're talking about is like often downstream. Educate people about it. I think actually what's really interesting is the marketing, again, upstream. What are all of the things that come together to build that story? Do you know Emma Froh? She's one of these scholars of the social studies of science. She's a PhD in biology, but she's been part of the community of SynBio for a really long time. How do we build this discipline? How do these products get made and deployed, and how do they live in the world? And her work is amazing and really fascinating, but she's doing some interesting work on the idea of containment of GMOs. And again, part of that sense of fear. Historically, a lot of GMOs were contained in the lab. Oh, don't worry about it. It's going to be in the tank. Don't worry about anything. And we use that to push aside any work of that communication in some ways around that fear. But now a lot of products like the biotics are outside of the tank. The GMO itself, the SynBio product, is a living organism that's out in the world. So she talks about that concept of containment is not about keeping something in. It's about all the things that keep the system together and make a great product. That you actually have to contain all of this like social and technical work together to market a product, to make something and bring it to market. And that includes regulatory and safety and technical work, but the marketing, who is it for? Why does it matter to them? How do you reach them? How do you translate? All of those things matter. And so the successful product, she has this really cool analysis about how successful products like hold all those things together. And so I'd say like that's marketing. It's actually the whole thing. Like you should like it because it's good for you, right?
Right.
Which I see again is this sort of knee-jerk pattern over and over and over with scientists. They're like, oh, you should just like it because it's good. Deal with it. It's like, no, it's not. It's good because it does all those good things together.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, the containment thing, we could spend a lot of time talking about that, but what I think is interesting is so many crops have already been genetically modified. As we deal with the climate and climate change, I've been obsessing on the security of the forests, what's happening in the Adirondacks. There's so much more rain. The humidity is so much higher. It means that there's like crazy fungus that are being released. As the ice caps melt, who knows what's going to be released from the permafrost. So we're going to have to just get used to living side by side with things that are genetically modified. I mean, if the forests disappear, we've lost carbon sinks and we've also lost lumber and tons of things. So there's no way. Containment, I think, is a great term for it. And what it also reminds me of is when Andrew Hissel talks about living underground and creating these underground communities. That's the place where you put all the genetically modified stuff, and then you just let the earth rewild. I don't think that we can do just one of those things. I always say we need everything everywhere all at once. So this idea of containment is super interesting because there's so many degrees of that.
I think you're falling into the same trap though. Like, oh, we already have everything. It's already GMO. Again, that fear, the worry around the products that are already GMO are actually a proxy for something else. So it's not the GMO-ness of the corn and soybeans or themselves necessarily a thing. Sometimes it's about the other chemicals that are part of the system. Sometimes it's about the control over agricultural systems. It's about like monoculture. It's about the kinds of foods that is enabled downstream. Like, oh, okay, corn is in everything. You use the same ingredients for all of these other things because that makes sense economically with how GMOs have created the system. So again, it's a systems problem that I think gets put into the fight over GMO, where it's not actually that. There's another anthropologist. I love all the anthropologists. She talks about, she's like, oh, people don't hate GMOs, they hate capitalism. Right? Again, to speak it to the system. All of these things and how they connect to our food and our culture and the downstream and all these other impacts that matters to people. That's part of the GMO. I think when there are more and more examples and more things that are possible, those systems will look different, will be different. Every product is a combination of a technology and the social environment and political environment around it. And the more we have those well crafted, well marketed, it becomes a different conversation. You don't have to live underground.
Unless you want to.
Unless you want to, I guess, if that's your thing.
I think I would have a hard time with it. I like walking outside.
I think we need some sun. Yeah. Sunshine and nature. We just need more forests. That'd be great. Yeah. So Ginkgo for 10 years.
10 years.
10 years. I know, a whole decade. Wow. Yeah. It's incredible. Yeah. I'm sure they're very happy to have you. They needed you. And you oversaw the creative marketing team. You also developed and launched Grow Magazine and a podcast and a bunch of other very specific campaigns. I will tell you that I love Grow Magazine. It is one of those brilliant pieces where it does marry the science, culture, technology, asking some of the really tough questions that the anthropologists are asking, people in sociology are asking. Are we continuing with Grow Magazine? What's going on with it? Should we create another magazine? I mean, it was so beautifully done.
Well, thank you. Grow is very special and essential to me. And I think it was founded in a particular time and a particular moment in Ginkgo's history too. I think Ginkgo had this really amazing openness and desire to be building this narrative and this vision for what synthetic biology was going to be. And that was really important to Ginkgo's business, where it was and at that time, and the community, again, that we wanted to bring together. We were really lucky to be able to spend time creating that space and that environment, and that ecosystem around Ginkgo because of the unique confluence of things around the business at that time. But yeah, we should be asking these questions and we should be able to create that space. And that is valuable to the business in the moment, and that we needed those things to happen. Currently a little bit on a pause, I'd say. Ginkgo is in a different place right now. It needs different things. The community is in a different place and needs different things. I think what emerges from this point of Synbio, what it starts to look like in the future is like up for grabs. And that's interesting and scary and exciting. And so I recently left Ginkgo after 10 beautiful years because I think, again, it felt like the right time for me, that there was a moment to ask different kinds of questions and where Ginkgo's business is going, the kinds of challenges that they need to answer that look different than the things that I'm excited about. I'm interested in those very early stages when those stories are first coming together. Where can we go? What's happening next? I think Ginkgo is going to be a part of that future and a part of where it goes. And we'll see what happens. But it grows on pause. I'm off to new things. Ginkgo is changing and still doing really interesting and important things. And Synbio, I think, is going to look different in the next 20 years than it did in the last 20.
What are the things that you're most excited about right now?
I'm excited about a few things. The early days of Synbio, there was a sense of, oh, complexity is too hard. Just get rid of it. We will abstract it away. We'll just make the parts. It'll work. It'll be fine. I always had an ambivalence about that. I wrote my whole thesis about how that's not going to work. Really engage with biology on its own terms. I think the same thing happened in SysBio. Like, oh, we're going to just write equations and understand mechanistically what's going on in biology. That doesn't quite work. It is a more complex system than we are able to sort of wrap our heads around. There's more things happening in context. There's so many interesting things. There's this really interesting moment right now, technically, with the rise of LLMs in particular, and the ways that LLMs think and do engineering. You program with data, that you give it context and it learns with you. It's able to interact with this substrate in different ways. The ways that we might interrogate biological systems and networks is starting to look a little bit different than some of these more like mechanistic, more programmatic, more engineering approaches that we were trying to force biology into in the past 20 years. AI is creating like a new way of interacting and a new approach, which I'm very excited about. And it feels different. I think that the narrative hasn't necessarily caught up. I think that there is still a sense of like, oh, we're going to just be able to engineer everything. And now biology and computers are the same. It's going to be great. I think we need to really wait and sit with that and really open that up. Like, well, what does it mean for how we think? Can we think differently, really, when we're working with biology in this different way? AI itself is an inscrutable thing that's like very much biological. People are trying to study it the way that they study brains. How interesting. What is that interplay going to start looking like? What are their new things? So I think there's conceptual shifts happening that are sort of like, oh yeah, because of the shift in how people are thinking about these tools of understanding and working with data. That's one thing that's exciting to me. I think on the other side, there's almost a renegotiation of the institutional form of how we do science that looks different and is different than experiments that came before. I think, again, early days of Synbio, you had a DIY bio parallel always within it. Oh, we're going to be the hackers. And I think actually the retrospective of that is really interesting to see how that actually created not millions of startups who solved everything because it's easy to do biology, but actually created a thriving bioart community, like a really interesting way for students to engage in these new kinds of questions, like opening up space for this kind of dialogue in new ways. I think that was, I would say, an unexpected outcome of DIY bio, very different than the unexpected fears of like, oh, the hackers are going to create a virus and kill everybody. But actually would have made sense. The thriving art community, I think no one predicted, and I think is really fabulous. But now there is still a sense, okay, like, there's not the form, again, of how humans work together and how humans fund science and how humans think about how we do science together. It's not quite right. There's academic stuff, there's startup stuff, there's a spectrum, there's different things, there's different ways of doing it. I'm just really interested in how there's a lot of experimentation now on these new forms of interaction and even more activity of scientists thinking that startups are a good idea. Again, 20 years ago, when I was in grad school, doing a startup meant you failed.
Yeah.
What are you doing?
You're going to start a company? Wait, what?
What? Why would you do that? Are you stupid? And so I think now, again, there's this more openness, there's more experimentation, there's more people really challenging the way we think and really opening up again, thinking about the practice of science and the work that we do and how we communicate and taking that seriously. There's still not enough thinking about the real human, emotional, and communication aspects of that. That is a space that I'm finding nice opportunities and fun things to do, at least starting. I'm calling this time a sabbatical because I want to understand that landscape and who's doing what and where the things are. But I'm finding a lot of openness, a lot of experimentation, a lot of new things starting, and still a gap in how we connect to people emotionally, how we think about the values getting into the technologies, how we build those bridges across different disciplines using language and different kinds of these technologies of communication. So those are things that I've been doing so far. I revived my blog, Oscillator, from way back when I was a student. So I have oscillator.blog on some Substack, and then I've been working as Oscillator, almost like consultancy for some of these projects, where again, there's really interesting new places to open up those conversations about how we communicate towards experimenting at the edges between where biology and technology are going, especially in light of AI. So that's what I'm excited about.
I think we're excited about the same things. I'm also super excited. I feel like people are interrogating their relationship to the natural world differently than they were even 10 or 20 years ago. And then you add the hyper object of climate change on top of all of that, which creates this sense of urgency. But I'm curious, what's your take on how does climate impact all of that you just mentioned?
That's a good question. I've been going through my own emotional and analytical thinking around climate change as a driver of action. I think it's very different now than it was 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago. It's always there, but it's much less a driver, it feels like, for most people than it was before. It's in this undercurrent. And again, I feel like that there's this anxiety to it and a fear of touching it directly because it's too big. The systems that make climate change happen are too complicated and too hard to touch. We're doing it obliquely. There's great work by Britt Ray, is a friend and previous collaborator, and she writes a lot about climate anxiety. What do you do when it's this big thing? I think there's also the piece of it that's, again, why do things not move or change fast enough? Or why can we not get at it directly? I think because it's so tied up in everything in the whole system of like how we do things, how people make money, how we make literally everything, that it's easy enough to just be like, oh, we can't yet, or it's fine. Drew Endy was talking about this. He talks about, it shouldn't be climate change because that implies this horror. You have to do something to avoid this bad thing that has not yet happened. And so basically that puts you in a situation where the bad thing has to happen before you act. The denial can continue, basically. We can keep pushing it aside until it happens. So he says, oh, we should do climate awesome. Switching to new systems will be awesome. Again, those are starting to happen. Maybe like, oh, solar is cheaper in many places. Oh my God, I have an electric stove now, electric car. I am actually like angry at how good natural gas marketing was and whenever they started doing it, because it is so much better to have an electric induction stove. Need a systems change to really support and be part of a bigger solution. They can be awesome. Where are there more opportunities to be awesome? And what does that start to look like? At the same time, the electricity you're going to need to make the AI models, that's scary. And people don't really know, again, how to engage there or what to do about it. How do we push back? How do we drive that? Is there just like, oh, we have to just make we have to make good carbon capture systems and we have to make good electric systems and nuclear power and on and on and on. And I think there's a path there too. So anyway, I'll just say I'm thinking about it. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I don't know where and how the biotech ingredients are going to fit in or where they're going to be. I don't believe biofuels are going to work. I think we should switch to electric. I think the systems we're going to need are more complicated. I think biology will always be a part of that. It's how we make our food and things and all this stuff. Anyway, deeply tied up in it, but I don't know where it goes. What do you think? What's going to happen?
Yeah, I do like how we're talking about reframing climate change. One of the things in terms of urgency, one of the terms that I had put forth was like climate destabilization, which is what's happening, and really attributing it to what is actually going on. Very intensive extractive processes. We're tearing down the rainforests, all because of our hyperconsumption of goods and what those goods are made out of. So, of course, on our podcast is called Grow Everything. The idea is that we are using biology to create these materials and create bio-based ingredients, and in a way that is biodegradable, it's regenerative, if you're going to scale up, we don't need to tear down a huge forest. Why don't we think about using biomanufacturing instead? And let's look at that. And all of that is, to what Drew Andy said, is climate awesomeness. It's a better way of doing things. And you can also get better functionality if you really think through what the bio-based ingredients is. We, of course, talk about K18, but there are a lot of other companies where they're making these bio-based ingredients that actually work. Some products out there, they have claims and we don't really regulate a lot of those claims. It's really sad, but they're just guessing like, all right, we'll just put these chemicals together. We know it feels nice, might not really do anything, but hey, we'll sell it and people will buy it and we'll make it cheap. But if you have a product that's actually working and high function, you can charge a premium. People will pay. People pay if it's a product that works, obviously the right storytelling. I mean, that's really a lot about branding. So I think that's a really important part of it, is really talking to a lot of, and this is what we're working towards as well and have been, is talking to those CPG companies, those big Pepsis and Nestle's and P&Gs of the world, that they are thinking of how do they biologize. But like you're saying, some of the people have the narrative where they're like, oh, well, we'll do it later because right now this is the money train's coming in. We don't want to disrupt our systems too much. So how do we phase an approach where we look at some products that can be biologized a bit sooner than others, and then let's start introducing that to our consumers, and the consumers will buy it. I mean, we're seeing even not just the CPGs, but other startups that are making products where they are making it bio-based and sustainably and have a great narrative, and they're sold out because they're making small batches. And C16 is a good example of that. They would make products in a batch and quickly sell out. And not that they make direct-to-consumer products, but it is a way for them to show their customers that, hey, look, you can market bio-based products, you can charge a bit of a premium price, and people will buy it because there's a narrative, there's a mission behind it. Save their rainforests. Don't just tear them down for palm oil. So I think that's a big part of, and it is, a lot of it is marketing, but it's also the actual biology that works, and telling people, look, this
like
biology
I said,
is biology.
marketing is the biology. Like it's all, it's the whole thing. It doesn't just come later. But yeah, I totally agree. I think there's a lot of, I think we just need to do that. The scope and the scale is so big of all of the things. It necessitates really rethinking a lot of stuff, the whole supply chain, how we make everything, where it comes from. And then really being honest about like, yeah, well, how much can you make? Where is the feedstock? Where is it going to come from? What do we need? Where do we go? I think, again, those are the same things, systems level problems that are part of the marketing and part of the product and part of the technology, but often feel like they're outside.
Yeah, I mean, this is related. So this morning, it was even on LinkedIn, I saw something about the beaches of Ghana and how they've been destroyed by fast fashion. Ghana is one of a number of countries in the world that have become these dumping grounds for fashion companies, and bales, tons and tons of clothing get sent to Ghana. And for them, it's destroyed their beaches. I have a picture that I've used a bunch of times that shows the Atacama Desert, the driest place in the world in Chile, which is also this huge fast fashion dump. It's so big that you can actually see it from space with a satellite. So we talked a little bit about overconsumption in our systems, and there is this overproduction of goods. Shoe companies, I think, produce 20 billion shoes a year. So that's wrong, 2 shoes per person a year if we're 8 billion people. But there is this overproduction, and rethinking that kind of production, the supply chains, and like understanding that things can be made in a circular fashion. And we've made enough for everybody already. I look at the Ghana thing, the Atacama Desert, and I mean, I'm thinking like a biologist, but also as a startup guy. And I'm like, those are huge opportunities to take those things and turn them back into something that is a resource that people can use. But that still doesn't solve the problem on the front end, where people are just overproducing, growing too much cotton, using all this water, polluting it with dyes that are unsustainable, et cetera, et cetera. But
yeah, but how do you
stop people from consuming?
Like, I don't know. That story's been, again, if those photos were enough, like we'd stop.
Yeah, they're not.
But it's not enough. I think that we really need to, what is it? Why not? It's not enough. It's not working. It's been a long time. You're like, fast fashion, keep going. Like people keep buying it. And we could say, oh, it's terrible that people keep buying these things. It's terrible that companies keep doing it. Where are the levers? What's the theory of change? Sure, we can have another conference about circular economy, but it's not in the systems that we have, in the economy that we have. They're not working. It's not enough. So I have fear again. So I want to lean into that fear again. but it's not enough to keep saying the same story. Do we need a different kind of product? Do we need a different way of thinking? Do we need to show it differently? So, I mean, it is amazing to see what C16 is doing. Like, it's great. Can that be enough? How do we get more momentum behind that? Where do they need to go? How do we grow that niche? How do we really make those products win? I think right now, again, in the market as it is, it's hard to win. It's hard to get out of where we're at. So I want them to win. It has to. I think if you play the tape out, it has to work. I don't know, it feels like it. Where else are we going to make the stuff? But it's going to look very different. So what are the things that we can do? Where are those levers? I think that those are really important to be thinking about.
Yeah. There's incentives. I mean, ultimately, where's the value to be had? So the reason why we have these big corporate companies, why they're overproducing and not selling all of their product is because that's how the money flows through these companies. They have a budget. They're like, all right, we're going to make this much. And if we don't sell it, but at least they make big enough margins, and they have the big marketing teams and say, look, buy our sneakers. You're going to be cool. And that message worked for a long time. But then you're starting to see these other companies saying, look, you buy a pair of shoes, we donate a pair of shoes, or these are recyclable shoes, or you can change the soles of these shoes if they get worn down. And then for these startups to show the value and that this works, you can be bio-based, it can generate a lot of revenue. And then showing that these bigger companies coming in and being like, okay, let's acquire you. Well, let's acquire that. You did all the heavy lifting. So now it's time for us to just take it over and start scaling this up for you, which again, K18 will have to bring them in too, because Unilever acquired them. They did all the heavy lifting. And then all of a sudden, Unilever was like, you know what? That's a type of company we do need. We do need it to be bio-based. We need them to have a great narrative, great story about biology, great story about sustainability, and not just a story, but both the story and the thing. They're walking their talk. And then, of course, there's politics. All of these big players, they're talking to all these politicians. So the regulations aren't necessarily there because it might be too limiting to some of these big organizations. And I don't want to get too political, but I just wanted to kind of voice that.
I mean, that's all to say, like, it's complicated, right? Like,
Yeah.
I think our economy today is built around fossil fuels, and that does matter to people. And I can understand, again, people do things for reasons.
For money.
For money, right? Like, and again, so again, people don't hate GMOs, they hate capitalism. Okay,
Yeah.
so even you're saying, oh, the companies are so wonderful, they're going to get bought by Unilever, and that's the win. That's the exit. That's what we're looking for. But then again, they're back to the same pressures of line go up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can the line go up? What does it look like? Can we rethink it really? What are the incentives for the people who work in those companies to do that differently? It's really hard to do anything. It's a miracle anything happens at all.
Yeah.
The fact that you can go to the supermarket and buy shampoo, like, my God, miracles upon miracles, but with the consequences. And so it's a tough problem. I've been reading some really interesting philosophy. This is by Richard Litwanton, Biology Under the Influence. So he talks about this Marxist philosophy and this idea of the dialectic. Things interact with each other. And if you have two things, it's never an either or. They're always interacting with each other. Nature, nurture. We fight about this. So you have people who are like, yes, biology, like, you're determined entirely by your genes. There's this huge now resurgence of psychotic eugenicists and racists online. Horrible. X is a real... Anyway,
Yeah.
It comes from that story. It's in your DNA. It's nature. Like, look at the graphs. And they can say how silly it is. All the people who talk about nurturing, blank slate, and this idea that you're completely disconnected from your DNA. You're together, and then in ways that are really complicated and ways that are difficult to unpack and unravel and untangle. And we want these simple stories and easy things. So he actually talks a lot also again about when you make new science, it can be like, oh, we're going to solve the world. We're going to save everything. It's going to be amazing. It's never that simple. When things go out into the world, like, oh, yeah, my God, antibiotics are amazing. The best ever. How wonderful. But if you use them, you get resistance to them. You always have this push and pull. You always have this interaction. You always have things that are unexpected in ways that mean you have to just keep being in it. You have to keep working on the things. How do you contain the system when it's out in the world in a way that we can't control everything? That's what it looks like. And that is hard. It's not just a spreadsheet. It's not something that the companies do. It has to be, I don't know, it's a different kind of work. And I think that's the thing that is, maybe we'll see more and more of that. And you do that at some of these smaller scales. And that's also something I'm excited about. Some of these newer things and newer ideas and newer technologies, the way that those companies, like there is a care and craft to that, all of that work of that marketing, of putting it all together and bringing it out to the world and being with it as is out there. Maybe that's a path, or that's one of the ways, again, in this dynamic, crazy push and pull of the world.
Christina, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. I mean, it's been incredible. I've seen you speak at panels, and just I remember we were at the BCG panel during SynBio Beta, and you really brought a very great perspective to the conversation. I think it was about biomanufacturing, and the other people on the stage were other men, not to say anything about men, Karl, sorry. But they were like, oh yeah, US,
Some of my
this,
best
that.
friends are men.
I kind of same. Yeah, exactly. But you really looked at it from a very systematic thinking, not just science, not just business, but culture and care. I loved when you were talking earlier about what is the heart of the message. And I wrote that down because I think when we asked you earlier, we were talking to this company and there's all scientists and they're like, you don't want to be lying about our science. We don't want to tell exactly what we're doing, but what is the heart of what you're getting to? And I think that's really important, a lesson to be shared with our audience. So I really want to take the time to thank you. Need to talk to you again because we're all friends. We think similarly in terms of science communications. You do have a different perspective. So it's incredible. Oscillator, I'm so excited for it. I signed up. I cannot wait to learn more, follow all of your incredible work as you're a part of this. I would say when you're looking at your sabbatical, but you're also dabbling. You're going to be dabbling and talking to all these other companies that you mass such a incredible network. So it's going to be great to read that as well. So we'll have that in the show notes for people to follow.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christina. It's just been a joy. It's always a joy to talk to you, and I'm looking forward to seeing you soon.
Really fun to talk. Thank you so much. We'll see you later.
Okay, Ram, what did you think of our conversation with Dr. Christina Agapakis?
It was incredible. Clearly, we could have kept the conversation going. She is a friend and kindred spirit of ours. I think it's a conversation that was long overdue on our pod. I mean, we've been wanting to get her on. She's been super busy. We got some proxy people like Cass Smith, who is our friend as well, but also worked alongside her. So that filled the gap. And Cass's episode is one of our top episodes on the podcast, Dreaming in Biology, which is a wonderful conversation with Cass. And you can see how Cass and Christina and the group really helped define Ginkgo's messaging and gave them a huge advantage of differentiating themselves from what other companies were doing, but didn't take the creative marketing approach that Ginkgo had done. And you can see why. You can hear Christina's excitement, passion, intelligence from the way she speaks. She's so excited and she's a deep thinker. But yeah, it was great to finally have her on the pod. How did you like the conversation? What were some takeaways for you?
I mean, you're right. Christina's a deep thinker. I've always welcomed how she is able to bring different perspectives into thinking about science communications. I used to nerd out on literary theory when I was doing my MFA. I can still go down that rabbit hole if anybody ever wants to nerd out with me on critical theory. I could talk about semiotics, deconstruction, psychoanalytic theory, et cetera, Lacan, Deleuze, Baudrillard, all those guys. I am nerdily well read on that stuff. And I think all of that has influenced my thinking on how we're supposed to tell stories for and with scientists and how people receive information. That is all currently reflected in our culture in the way that we are communicating. There's a lot of different ways that brands are communicating. And I think that the ways that brands communicate, science communications or biotech communications is not yet caught up to the way that brands communicate. I mean, there's still this thinking among even biotech communicators that you got to get in the New York Times, you got to get in the Wall Street Journal, you have to be on big TV. And that other message where we're the ones that create the media, we're the ones that have to be the media channels, still hasn't penetrated many of the older biopharma companies, whereas we do see a lot of that in companies like Ginkgo, where they are creating the media, they are telling the story, they are controlling the narrative. And that is super important. It is what we tell our clients. So I think that Christina embodies that. She said she's working with scientists now. And part of our conversation afterwards was, hey, let's figure out how we can work together.
Yeah, absolutely. So part of the conversation with Christina, the conversation we have with other scientists, we were talking about how we were talking to a new startup and we had this conversation with the founders, and they were afraid that they were going to do their science a disservice by making a concise message because it's not going to relay all of the hard work. And even that concise message, when it goes to the next level, they're afraid that people won't understand. And I think when we're on both sides of the field, because we're talking to these scientists, we're talking to these entrepreneurs, some of these entrepreneurs are selling to other scientists. That's one thing, but they might not be specific in their field. They're selling to CEOs or business people who might not know the sciences as well, or they're selling to consumers. We work with K18 directly. They're selling directly to consumers. But what we have observed is that people are becoming smarter. We have to give them a chance. We can't assume that people are dumb because they don't have a PhD. That's not fair. And especially with AI becoming commonplace, it'll take them 2 seconds to do some research and get enough to be dangerous information so that they can start going down a rabbit hole. Hopefully they're finding the correct sources and they're using maybe consensus, which seems like a good science-driven AI. They're looking at papers. Hopefully those papers are correct, which again, that's another conversation about some established publications. But anyway, I think when it comes to talking about sciences to people, yes, there's a fear on the scientist side that people won't get it, but saying that don't worry, because if they don't, they will be able to figure it out and just do your message a service, speak from your heart and talk about it. Just share the information that you have as best as you can. And then if it's not working and you need some help, come talk to us at Messaging Lab, because we can certainly help guide you in the right direction and ensure that your message gets out there, it's clear, and you're able to achieve your business goals.
The only thing I would add to that is if you don't have a story, you don't have a business.
Mm-hmm.
And we have it on our website. The story is a strategy. It's a quote from Ben Horowitz, one of the great investors and entrepreneurs of our era. It's especially true for science-based businesses. People are a lot smarter than you think they are. We want to give people that chance to understand, like you said, Erum. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for telling really great science stories. So I appreciate Christina coming on. I appreciate all the clients that we have. And I appreciate the fact that we're able to share these stories with everyone who listens to this podcast.
With that, thank you so much for listening. We're inviting you to be a part of our community. We have a Patreon page. Please sign up, become a Patreon, and be a part of our community. It's just like having a cup of coffee with your friends. And we welcome your thoughts, your ideas, your suggestions, any new research that you're coming across that you think will be fun for us to chat about. We have all of our contact information in the show notes. So thank you so much.
That's the pod.